of Meridian Trust. Mark's leadership journey at Meridian in Cambridgeshire started, I believe, in 2010, since when he's overseen that trust growing from 2 to 28 academies. Our other speakers today are Academies specialists from the firms in PrimeGlobal, which is an association of independent accounting and audit firms. We collaborate as Academy specialists, sharing challenges and intelligence, meaning that individually we're able to deliver first-class services and advice to the sector. They are, our speakers are Mark Nicholls from CKCA in the West Midlands, James Gare from Monahans, which is a firm in the southwest around Swindon, Bath and Taunton, David Wright from Westcott, which is even further south, from Bristol to Plymouth. Myself from Larking, Gowen. Gilly McGill is a VAT specialist from Larking, Gowen. David Wright again is Westcott, and Sophie Austin from Monahans. Okay, let's get going properly. If you have questions, please type them in the queries box. We have time built into each session at the end to pick up on the questions. And now for our keynote speech, which is, as I said before, is a response to the government's policy statements. We can't be certain of where they're going to turn out, but we know the ambition and the direction of travel, which is growth. So Mark, what is your experience of growth?
Good morning. Welcome, colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to share what's been our journey, our adventure, etc. Hopefully, as it is very much a sort of a personal narrative based around exactly what we've done. Hopefully there'll be some elements that will chime with experiences of other colleagues, maybe a few things that will enable you to reflect on parts of history, possibly as well, as Giles has suggested, to look forward into what may be coming next. One of the most obvious things, and I apologise for it straight away, is one of the impacts of COVID has clearly been out-of-date photos. So the photo that was just previously shown does look anything like me, but I assure you I am the same person still. There seems to be a lot more facial hair around post-COVID. It's one of the major impacts I've noted in our team. To give you some idea at the very beginning, we start as an outstanding secondary school at Swasey Village College, which is 8 miles northwest of Cambridge. The statements and most of the slides, I think there's only 4 new slides on the way through here. I thought what I'd do is try and pull things that came from the actual times themselves. So many of the slides that you'll see on the way through here, they actually come from that period. So in 2011 or 2010, when we were originally starting to say what we wanted to do and who we were going to be. We were formerly known as the Cambridge Meridian Academies Trust, now just known as Meridian Trust. So anybody who's familiar with them, I'll probably interchange between using those 2 names without actually noticing it. But this was our original statement back to what we wanted to be when we were telling the DFE that we should be allowed to become a multi-academy trust sponsor. This wasn't really the start of the journey, though. And if you can click the slide, should move forward and show you a lovely picture of a part of Cambridge here. Sorry. First of all, the mission, vision and mission. We were very fortunate from having had the time to think about what we wanted to be, to start to really establish where we thought that we could be able to work and what we thought a multi-academy trust could be. The reason I've highlighted the 2 yellow boxes particularly are that these have come from the refresh. At the end of 10 years, we had a birthday party and started to look at whether we were doing what we said we were going to do or not. And we haven't really moved away from the idea of successful learners and valuing individuals. It does feel a little bit new Labour speak at this time, but there's still things we're quite very committed to. We are struggling quite a lot at the moment with being hub for community activities. As Giles has already referred to, there's a massive pressure on us around energy and charging and whether people can afford to come and engage with the sorts of things that we can offer for them. So something I'll return to later on. The 2 things that we identified at the end of 10 years was that we'd actually started to really understand what it meant for staff more than we ever had done at the beginning, and acknowledge the fact that in our first 3 parts of our mission, we hadn't said anything about the people who deliver it. And the other thing we'd actually become much clearer about was what we actually thought the role of the trust was. When there were 2 schools, the trust was not really very much more than a few of us, as I'll show you in a moment. However, now it's quite a considerably different beast, and we have to think of ourselves in quite a different fashion. If you click the slide forward, Giles, sorry. So that was the aforementioned slice of Cambridgeshire. It's now known as Northstowe. It was going to be the largest new town in Europe, and we were first told about it in 2006, and that's really the start of our growth journey. Myself and a colleague were ensconced in Swavesey Village College and trying to turn it from being one of the greyest schools in, well, certainly Cambridgeshire, but probably East Anglia, into something that was a little bit more interesting and met the desires of the local people. This lovely area here is the old Oakington Barracks as part of it, and it was being slated as the largest new town. Now, what we found out was that you could form something called an educational trust, and you could then start to bid to be able to run a school. So we started to explore in 2006 what those opportunities might be like, and started traveling around looking at other trusts that are maybe 1 or 2 usually at most, schools that were all part of the same educational trust. We learned how to make a bid for the school, and we bid to be able to open the primary school and the secondary schools and all through, and we talked a lot there about an all-inclusive community. We entered that bid in 2006, we were awarded it in 2008, and it was due to open somewhere between 2011 and 2013. And then, as happens, if Giles clicks his button, this thing happened to us. Now, eventually, as you'll see later on, Northstowe does open, but actually, rather than opening in 2011, when I thought I would probably go on and be the first head teacher of the school, it was 2019 before we actually got to open it, just before a pandemic, but we did get to open one part of it during a pandemic, all of which seems very, very bizarre at the moment. So we've been growing the leadership team at Swavesey with the idea of forming a hard federation with the school around the corner. We'd actually fallen out with a number of our other local schools who wanted to form a soft federation. But I think this kind of shows where our growth comes from, in this sense that something greater than an individual school. So we always stuck to the idea of a hard federation, the idea that we would be stronger as a school or as schools if we managed to share absolutely everything. And there was no idea that we would be able to, as we called it at the time, go steady. We were very much in our infancy, and we were very much committed to the particular values that we held. Credit crunch hit, and we were suddenly faced with the fact of what do we do when we've got an overinflated size of leadership team preparing to have the capacity for next. The next slide, or the next picture, demonstrates something that probably shows you also our innocence, and it's almost embarrassing to look back at it. But we decided that rather than having to have redundancies or restructures or anything like that, that we would go back to what one of our colleagues chimed with Huggy Bear, who you may be familiar with if you have the same kind of age profile as I do. Huggy Bear, Starsky and Hutch was a pimp, and we decided what we would do is strategically pimp ourselves out around the locality just to see ourselves through the credit crunch. So we wouldn't start restructuring and getting rid of colleagues. We would find places to go, things to do. And so we jumped in, the next picture, our mystery van, and we set out around the locality trying to find a way in which we could make these visions, the skills, the abilities, the things that we believed in, see how we could make them work. I'll leave it up to you to work out which one my colleagues think I am from that picture. I believe probably by the end you'll have formed your own opinions. The next slide, or the next picture. Swavesey Village College is quite well known as an affluent area. These are the kinds of houses that you find certainly in the village of Swavesey itself. And on the right hand side of the picture, as we look at it, I thought I'd just share a little bit of how the school was doing at the time. So CVA, again, for those who have a long memory, we were very successful. Everything was going beautifully. We were looking to see what we'd be able to do to be able to push that further. You click again. We found ourselves in a school in Peterborough, which was not the original plan, but quite interesting, and particularly interesting for me, as the school that's reflected on the right is actually the school that's approximately a mile away from my front door as I sit talking to you today. So I ended up taking over my local secondary school, which I was pretty clear at the time, as you can see from the data, there was no way on this earth that my children would ever attend that school. It's actually a matter of immense pride to be able to say that my daughter is there in year 13 at the moment, doing very well and working very hard, or I sincerely hope she is today. It was quite a journey, and we talked a lot about the idea of applying the same philosophy in different contexts. At the time, that was really to try to capture the fact that you could do different things in schools, because we were very clear that these were not identikit schools. Part of the game, though, and I think we've always been like this and trying to represent it, is actually those two photos tell a bit of a lie, because they're actually houses from the opposite catchment area. And I think there's always been quite an easy way of lazily labelling schools rather than really getting underneath what happens there. But that was our first journey when the credit crunch didn't hit, and Northstowe didn't happen. We had to get out and do something different. And we finally managed to find a school that we formed a multi-academy trust with. It wasn't particularly that we wanted to be a multi-academy trust, but a hard LA federation offered us absolutely £0, and there were multi-million pounds sponsoring becoming a multi-academy trust at the time. So we took the most expedient choice. You can click the next one, Giles. This was our original org chart. There was the executive principal and principal of Swavesey. I was the principal of Neame Park, the former deputy at Swavesey. We had a business and resource manager that was shared, a trust site manager, and a trust clerk. That was it. The two IT managers decided that they were going to emigrate to two different places from the two schools, and we used that to be able to do what we thought at the time was realising the multi-academy dividends. We talked about the belief that we were going to achieve economies of scale. I'm not entirely certain whether we've really managed to do that to this day. I think there's always an interesting battle about whether you're going to find an economy of scale or whether you're going to be able to have greater expertise. Certainly, as we reflect back on it, those early promises that we were making about career opportunities, I'm not really sure that they really held much water. The idea that there was suddenly going to be a whole load of extra career opportunities when we became two schools, or indeed we became three, there weren't actually very many at all, as the diagram demonstrates. There are a few opportunities for people to go and work in an additional school, but to be honest, we've been doing that for a number of years through working with the local authority. The expertise beyond one school, there wasn't a great deal when you only brought two into it. And the idea that we had robust systems, I think we very, very quickly demonstrated that we didn't really have those robust systems, because the level of challenge of moving to somewhere like Peterborough, moving to somewhere where a significant proportion of the young people had English as a second language, really called into question all sorts of the different ways in which we thought about it. It wasn't necessarily, I think, as we grew, we certainly had that enthusiasm and optimism that's demonstrated in the Scooby-Doo pictures, etc. But actually, we began to realise very, very quickly that it was a little bit harder than we thought it was going to be. You can click on the next slide. We'd always focused around, and I'll mention her a few times, been very, very lucky to be working with an excellent trust chair who had worked for Cambridge Enterprise in developing companies. And I think that's been incredibly useful. It's an easy thing for us to forget about the importance of governance on the way through, and certainly ours have had a major impact in the way that I think I've developed on the way through. I'm originally an English teacher, as the narrative nature of the story I'm telling this morning will illustrate to you. I've had to learn an awful lot on the way through this, and I think that's been the major role that the governance have had. They've turned somebody who used Scooby-Doo pictures into somebody who uses all sorts of figures and numbers later on. We focus very quickly on a specific geographical area. That focus upon travel times and ensuring that staff can communicate and share resources. I recognise through exactly what we're doing this morning, there's all sorts of ways of doing that very sophisticatedly now through technology, but certainly back in 2010, 11 and 13, etc., we were having to work on the fact we needed to get people between. What we found was it's hard to move teachers. Teachers can get disrupted by the A14. Leaders, if you're a little bit late, it doesn't matter so much. We also had that vision from the beginning that we wanted to be something that was larger than just one or two schools working together. We sort of had that sense that something like the group that's described there would be the sorts of things that we were looking for. You can click on the slide again. This is kind of the first part, or the second, third part of the journey indeed, where we start to work our way through how do you then grow? So you've got the first school is Swavesey, the second school was the 100th percentile at the time from its data. The third school, we had the local authority come and invite us to take it over. They had performed in the bottom 8 for all secondary schools in the country. The SNs indicate where we've got special measures schools. Stamford Wellands was originally, it was a bid for a free school to be opened in the town of Stamford, but the DfE informed us that if we were to open that school, we would close the existing school almost inevitably. So how did we fancy taking over the local failing school? They had 29 students recorded for year 7 that year. It's a secondary modern school in a selective county that's exactly next door to places like Rutland, which are not selective, and I would go as far as to say not very comprehensive either. So you can see on the way through the beginning part of it, we were always kind of balanced between this idea of being kind of loving and fighting. We wanted people to choose to join with us, and yet a lot of the time they didn't. A lot of the time what happened was I'd get phone calls from people, for example, at Salisbury Village College, and if you'd like to look that one up and read the story, I think it still stands as one of the most appalling abuses of power in a secondary school in the country from the former head teacher. You can get a bit of a sense of the challenge that we faced there. Certainly one of the more interesting occurrences when I came home and explained to the family that if we didn't sort out the fire safety at the school, I could actually go to prison, which was a bit of a lesson to be learned for an English teacher, that was the kinds of responsibilities that we were now starting to deal with. At Ely College, we've been watching very carefully about what was going on. We've been told there was going to be a sponsor. We'd had no sponsor forthcoming. And then I got what I called the inevitable call from the Regional Schools Commissioner saying, have you ever heard of a place called Ely, Mark? And all of a sudden we were finding ourselves engaged in taking on a very large, very much in deficit, very much special measures, very much at war with the union secondary school. So we found ourselves kind of wanting to grow and wanting to do it in quite a positive fashion, but actually finding ourselves increasingly just becoming people who solved other people's problems, were brought in to fight, as the image demonstrates to you. We did eventually talk two of our local primary schools into joining us. And again, that tries to give you in the numbers, it shows you where the connections sit between schools. So Stamford in the blue coat with the purple, they're schools that are within catchment, because we've always had that all through, all inclusive basis to what we were going to do. So throughout, there's been a piece of logic or logic working in, sitting in behind it. Northstowe, as I say, eventually arrived as School 13, and School 14, the Martin Bacon Academy, is a special school that's right inside the Northstowe site. So we grew over a period of time through 5 special measure schools, 7 financial in difficulty. We were bringing on the problems, always focusing on where we could stay within catchment, always trying to stay within those 15-mile boundaries, but pretty much taking on most things. We decided at Swavesey very early on that the answer to changing it from being the greyest school in England was to say yes to practically anything we were asked to do. I think we were doing that on the way through here as long as it met those conditions. Pick the slide. We did have a bit of an epiphany moment where we started to work out that we'd become what was called the kidney bean, which I've horribly drawn on there in yellow for you. Trustees were recognising that we were around Peterborough and Cambridge, and suddenly we'd started to think about what we could do that was different. Part of that was trying to work out how we managed to get to that 10 and 20 school and that sense of growth that was in the beginning, but stayed true to what we'd originally said. So I remember a trustees meeting where I brought the radical idea that we could move from a 15-mile circle to a 20-mile circle. Again, this is the original slide that I started to show them with the schools drawn on and the cross drawn across to start to think about what that might mean and the way in which we would be able to grow into those different directions. It was also a bit of analysis about where the quality of other trusts were at that particular given time. And it was ever more evident that there were an awful lot of very strong trusts, which I'm sure a number of you are familiar with, around Cambridge. They were less so as you started to move into East Northants and Peterborough and down towards Bedford. So we started to think about how we might be able to grow to meet those aspirations we had in the first place. One of the key things around our growth, I think, has always been this sense that it's an evolution plan. So I have copies of that. That's one of the ones I can't quite see the date on it from here, but that's just one version of it. Since 2014, we've been keeping an evolution plan that talks about both the major values that we hold and the major things that we're seeking to try to achieve, but also gives an idea of the fact that we're not particularly fixed with one outcome. We don't have to stick to something. It's not necessarily as controlled as a development. We recognise the fact, very much back in the Scooby-Doo van, that we're still on the way through the multi-academy trust journey at the moment. To some extent, the white paper is just another variant of that, as far as I can see it. It's another one where the pesky kids have to work out what the solution is. The little grid on the right demonstrates we don't keep one like that anymore, but it was quite a clear piece for a long time about where's the guidance for your CEOs? What do you actually want them to engage with? What are your actual priorities around growth? And we recognise it would always be a bit like buses. And indeed, at one point, we rejected one school because I'd had a conversation with the Regional Schools Commissioner who said that the school we were really interested in joining us wouldn't be allowed to join us if we took on the risky school they were asking us to take on first. And I asked, what if I switched them round? And they said, oh yeah, you could take on the safe school and then take the risky school because we want you to take the risky school. I didn't really understand the logic of that because it was the same level of risk in the end. But actually, we just followed our guidance. In the end, we never took the risky school on. You can just click the slide again. This is actually where we stand today. So these are the 28 schools that are all formed as part of Meridian on the way through. And you can see quite a transition, I think, as we go past that school, sort of 17, 18, 19, it shifts quite considerably. And a lot of this was done during COVID. We didn't sit still. But what we've identified, and I think that's common with a number of other trusts, is that the kind of growth, the kind of capacity that we have now, it's all proportional. The idea that when we were Swavesing, we became Neam Park as the trust, we doubled in size. That was absolutely dramatic. Then you go to North Cambridge, you've only gone by half. When you go to West Town, that's only a quarter, albeit our first primary school, which was quite a significant shift. When you then start taking on trusts later on, you can generate that level of capacity. And indeed, you suddenly start to change where you are on different people's radars. And I think you access a different level of help, to be perfectly honest. So we've actually had 2 experiences of trust development now. The first one was the Sharnbrook Academies Federation had hit quite difficult times, lots of change, bit of a lack of direction, I think, had actually occurred. So we took that originally on as an interim CEO role. 10 months later, they voted to join the trust. We're still working through quite all what that means to us and trying to work through that legacy. It's certainly the first time when people have seen, or at least one of the first times where people have seen the legacy trust as being the major issue. Normally, people are quite happy for us to arrive. The merger came later, where I think I'd identified that our secondary growth had all been planned for. I'll demonstrate in a moment how we've been working on having executive principles and how we've developed our finance structure, very much around pyramids, very much around working out where the next levels are going to be, using TCAF to be able to provide just ahead of when we need the capacity. But when it came around to the growth in the primary schools, I hadn't actually allowed for as much as we then found. And so we found that the best way to be able to secure the growth that we've made was to do more, which actually gave our trustees a little bit of a moment when they'd said you need to stop and consolidate for a period, and I pointed out that growth was the best way of consolidating by bringing the excellence that was part of Cambridge Primary Education Trust into the trust. Quite a different way of having to think about things, but I think we have to shift our mindsets continuously on the way through. You can click the next one. I got asked this doing an NPQEL thing, and this was actually what I wrote by one of the NPQEL people. They said, by now, having told us all you've told us, you must know everything and you must know exactly what you're doing. I clearly have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just quite good at changing as we make our way through and actually trying to go back to those core values. What are we trying to achieve? What's in the best interest of young people and communities? And as long as you can keep going back to that, I think you're in a pretty decent place. And you've got people around you who are very direct in their questioning of whether that's just something you're saying that's convenient. We've learned that there are disasters that know it. That's really easy to work with because they actually know it and they really want to change, and that's tremendous. Disasters that don't know it are an absolute nightmare to be able to work with because they will spend their entire time in denial, making life difficult, indeed trying to make you become the problem as quickly as they come. We actually found those who chose to join us the most complicated because a lot of the time it was if it isn't broken. It was almost like they wanted what we call the service level agreement piece, which really worried me about the try before you buy, because actually, as it says later on, leveraging the trust benefit actually means making some structural change, or I believe it does. And you need to be able to do that, or else all you're doing is trading off bits of autonomy for nothing, or maintaining autonomy and you'll get nothing from the trust. Certainly one of the key things for us is having all of the schools on the same GCSE syllabi. And the areas where we've had the greatest disparity in results this summer are the ones where they haven't, very small subjects, where we didn't insist on everybody sharing. It just means we don't find it. Rogues, it's always a massive test when you go into any new organisation. My dad was the head teacher and he told me, whenever you go into a new school, son, never trust the first person who comes up to you and says they need a decision making urgently, because they're lying to you. They're trying to make you make a bad choice very early on. There's a little nugget. My dad's been very useful in terms of framing it. He's almost like a governor or isn't one. I don't really regret any of the things that we've done. I absolutely regret some of the times when we didn't do things. I think it's been very difficult, being completely honest. We've quite often told people things like that tough question, just the head teacher's job guaranteed? And when you say no, you don't tend to be the choice. I still think it's the right thing to do, though. So we just say what it is. And I simply don't trust the system. Sorry to have to say that out loud. But we had 4 Ofsted inspections last term of schools that had joined us during COVID. And the idea that they had a proper conversation about what the impact of that was is frankly laughable. The same as the number of times with Sawtree, the RSC said they were going to work with us on turning around the fact that it was a hellhole of a building. They were nowhere to be seen when the fire officer served the notice on me that said we had to fix it. It was very much firmly in my court. I think we need to be very strong and working together. I think the system has to reshape it, because I don't trust those who are supposed to be shaping it. You move the slide on, sorry, Giles. My dog's obviously getting very interested in what I'm saying, so apologies if you can hear it in the background. I was told by my finance team when I shared this that there weren't enough numbers in it for auditors and accountants. So this is my attempt to share you some numbers. We've gone from 155 staff to over 2,000 staff. The idea of the responsibility for that and the student numbers, as you've seen, it was scary enough, 1,200 students, but 18,000 today. It's quite terrifying at times. Financially, 5,200,000 to over 106 million this year. The interesting thing is it's all the same. It's the same principles as long as you go back to them. The major fears for us on the way through, I haven't said much about it yet, but the original head teacher of Swavesey, unfortunately, Martin Bacon, he passed away at roughly 2013 as we were just moving from being 2 schools to 3 schools. Losing a dear friend and an inspirational colleague at that time was one of the hardest things we ever had to do. I think it took a long time for us to recover. I occasionally get asked about where we have our succession plan. I'm still not sure that we've got a new one because we're still playing the last one out. And it takes a very, very long time to recover from things like that. Around schools 7 and 8, we nearly went bankrupt. I remember losing my temper in one meeting, which doesn't happen very often, but saying that we seem to be focused on where we're going on our holidays while our house is on fire. Some of what we did then, 3-5 years later, was genius. However, at the time, we weren't dealing with the problems that we had. We were living in some kind of weird, isolated bubble. Had to redo a massive restructure around how our finance teams worked at that point. In 2018-19, I mentioned or cited before, cultural backwards. A couple of the early schools, we hadn't kept an eye on them enough, and they'd actually defaulted back to how they were before. And I put the last one on because people told me that in bringing trusts into the trust, I said it was really quite easy, but a number of my colleagues told me I was completely wrong and that it was a massive stress and strain. That probably just shows you the quality of the colleagues, and maybe it just shows you the fact that maybe I lost touch, I think, at that point when we were on the way through COVID. But I think it's really quite a structural change, and I think that identity change and that shift is still something we're working through now. So I don't think we're finished with that. You can click the next one. I realise my time's about past. This just gives you a bit of an idea to contrast with slide 2 or 3, the original. These are now our executive leadership team. So that top line, my chief operating officer, a number of executive principals in secondary. We've changed and have a deputy CEO leads on the primary edge, and we've had Mary working with us around SEND for some time. The level of quality of the people in there and the way in which they can look at, we think, financially for schools and educationally for schools in secondary, and somewhere around 6 or 7 in primary with an executive lead is about right. We still need to work out how that will work in special needs. But that gives you a bit of an idea about how we can plug pretty much that yellow line where Darwin Green is. I should be able to plug 1 extra secondary school in along that bottom, so we're ready for what happens next. That's partly because of the level of challenge in some of the schools we've taken on, is why it's good for there to be 3 at the moment. It kind of gives you an idea about how the financial and the educational should sit alongside each other. The next slide will give you an idea of the finance team. Changed quite a bit from that original 1 business manager and the level of expertise they've had. This diagram, if anybody wants to see it, the full version, I took all the names off for obvious reasons, but I can give you a proper version of this if anybody would like to see it or talk through any of the rationale that sits behind it. Almost the penultimate slide. This is where we are today. The two images just give you a bit of an idea about how I did have a dartboard shown on here. Clustering in darts is obviously a major skill. That looks like we're quite separate, but if you just click the slide, Giles, it gives you a bit of an idea. When you look nationally, our clustering is rather stunning. So we've been quite proud of how that's worked. Next slide, please. The white paper, too many questions. I don't understand. We seem to want regional, but they're not regional. What's the ideal size? I don't think they have any idea. I don't think there's any evidence or proof of that at the moment. So all we want to do is consolidate and grow in the best way possible for the system. Governance has been the absolute goal behind it. They need to renew and restructure, and we need to elevate ourselves and where they look at again. Energy pay rises and inflation. I asked the DFE the other day if 30k was an ambitious starting salary, is it still now? 10% inflation, surely it's 33 grand, but they didn't seem to have an answer for me. We survived cyber hacking and pandemics. I think being in a trust, it's just absolutely more manageable. We'll continue to deliver on those promises. There's some various pieces there. Please have a look at some of the videos we put together. I hope they'll entertain. And if you do want to ask anything beyond today, the email address is there for you to be able to use. Now, the final slide kind of gives you a bit of a clue. I'm an English teacher. I thought I'd have a little game with this. So if you've wondered why there were babies and soldiers and lovers, and there was one where it had the merchant in his age of the justice, rather, with a fair round belly. Fortunately for you, the camera doesn't reveal that of me today. But I think that kind of tells you a little bit of a story of the 7 ages of our map. We certainly were mewling, puking babies in the nurse's arms. We went through, I don't think we were moving unwillingly to school, but we were certainly very much learners. Then trying to persuade people, then learning to fight battles, maybe we're a little bit rounder in belly and longer in the tooth now. Last click, Giles, I promise.
Oh, sorry.
It's all right. 2 things I've found very useful. One is very old. Martin Bacon used to talk to us about the sigmoid curve. When you think you're doing well, you need to go again. The other thing I've been reading is the infinite game, and I think that's fantastic. Do you have a just cause? Do you know what you're trying to do? Do you recognise your worthy rivals? And despite whether you don't like them or not, do you learn from them? What we have to do is learn how to play and continue in the game, and that's the way we need to respond to the white paper, because we're going to be able to. If there's an existential crisis at the minute, we need to deal with it flexibly, and we all need to show the courage to lead. They're pretty much the chapter titles on the way through that book. And having read it over the summer, I thought it was absolutely timely, so I thought I'd share it today. If there's any questions, please feel free. I apologise for the dog, who's very, very excited.
We can't hear the dog. Thank you very much, Mark. That's amazing. I say, if there's any questions, please just come on. Either type them into the chat box or come off mute. Please do that. That was extremely honest. Thank you very much, Mark. I think you've been
Mark,
really
I've got a question for you.
okay, James.
I mean, I suppose, being an auditor, I've seen this sort of growth of multi-academy trusts. And at the beginning, I think there was a real sort of range of cultures. So, I worked with some who were, almost like North Korea, and, you did it our way or not at all. Others were very laissez-faire. And I wondered whether you felt that your journey through, growing as a MAT, you've kind of had to adapt that culture and sort of, where you've ended up on that spectrum, really.
Yeah, it's been a complex piece on the way through. I think I alluded to it at first, that we thought we were running the best school in the whole world, had all the answers to absolutely everything back at Swavesey, and we thought we were going to come out and be able to share all sorts of different things. And very early on, I mentioned before, you suddenly find our experience of EAL at Swavesey was 2 children, Pavel and his brother Camille. And I worked out a solution for them that pretty much depended on me as the deputy head doing a whole load of extra work to make sure I helped them. And we were proud of what we'd done. And then we moved up the road to Peterborough and found that about 15–20% of the students had the same issues, and that suddenly you weren't going to be the answer. Heard from Peterborough, the director of Ed, this morning, that there's been 1,097 new arrivals in Peterborough just during the summer holidays. Suddenly you were finding that day 1 in September, you had hundreds of children arrive, many of whom couldn't speak the language and had all sorts of levels of difficulties. There's no good just telling people that they have to stick to what your system says. You have to have that constant kind of battle between the idea of the sedimentation and the regularity of it and innovation. Otherwise, you just turn into a fossil. Innovation will continue around us. Other people have better ideas. Indeed, there are more than one great idea in terms, and I wish somebody had explained this to Ofsted at the moment, but there's more than one way of having a great education system. And actually, there's more than one way of doing fine things for young people. And many, many young people need different things. So we've been relatively flexible about it. I'm sure a few people would say we are a bit North Korean in some of the discussions that we've had about the fact that you will be following the same GCSE English. And I recognise sometimes that causes difficulties, but I hope that we're able to articulate why. Because if you're joining and you're going to come into, so one of the lovely things we do, we'll have all of our English teachers together in October. There's no point if they're all doing a different syllabus and different texts and different pieces of information. They can't do that learning together. I still think we need to work out how we do sponsored innovation over time, though, so we can continue to have that change.
We've got one more question, Mark. How long did mergers take?
I've just typed an answer there actually as well.
Oh.
One was very quick. That was because, and I think it's fair to share, the trustees of the organisation had gone to see the RSC and said that they were in trouble. They had struggled replacing their former CEO, and so they were basically in, well, they were within 24 hours of being in breach of the handbook. So they knew they had to do something pretty sharpish. So that started in the October and then was concluded by the next September. The other one with CPET, I think it's an honest statement, and again, it's all you'll ever get from me. I don't think if Martin Bacon hadn't fallen ill, I don't think we'd have ever been two trusts in the first place. So certainly with Larking, Gowen as auditors, we've been working. Indeed, we ran the finances for Cambridge Primary Education Trust for most of their lives as a trust. So I think that was one where it was just that moment where I sat down with their CEO and said, I think you want to grow, and I think we've grown too fast in primary. And I think the answer actually is we come together at this point, because I think it'll be a much better thing to be able to do. And then we started working out what that would mean on a pragmatic level. I went to once a long time ago, long enough ago for Frank Green to have been, I think, the National Schools Commissioner. And I listened to a number of CEOs who sat there during the meeting talking about how no CEO, actually, no head teacher recognises how much better it'd be to join a trust and what was wrong with them. And I just asked the question then why none of the CEOs had actually mentioned that merging with another trust would be the best. I think we're all kind of wedded to that. I think we need some kind of arrogance to be able to stand there in front of young people and families to be able to tell them that we're going to do the right thing. I think there's going to be a whole change in the system that's forthcoming now. I think we need to work out how we can manage to have room for people to be able to have those voices within trusts. Believe me, that leadership team I've got, I laughingly sometimes say that what I do is I try and find the most contrary, difficult people in Cambridgeshire, Peterborough and the surrounding area and get them into my leadership team. Because you've got to be pretty strong to be in there, but you've got to be pretty committed and you need to ask tough questions. I went to see Apple, and if anybody gets
I'm going to move on. Mark, sorry,
Right.
I could listen to you all for the whole morning, but we've got some other people who we will let come in. That's fascinating. Thank you very much. And genuinely thank you for being so honest about the errors and honest about the uncertainties and for being so thought-provoking. But we will move on. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And we're moving on to technical update to Mark and James.
Fantastic, thank you, Giles. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Academies Accounts Direction, which I'm sure you're all aware is this sort of guidance that the SFA releases annually, which sort of talks about how you prepare your statutory accounts. And there's a little bit in there about how you might expect them to be audited as well. So if you've missed it, this did come out this year at the end of March, and of course it applies to the 21-22 financial year. So it is all relevant for the statutory accounts that you're probably all producing at this moment in time. And alongside this document, the SFA always produces these model accounts, which are called Coketown. And there's some quite useful information in there as well. Now, there was also the separate document that was produced around the same time, which is called the Framework and Guide for External Auditors and Reporting Accountants of Academy Trusts. And this really is a document aimed at auditors. But this also was sort of pointing out some areas that the SFA think that Academy Trusts may be lacking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of that. I'm going to go through everything that's in the accounts direction, all the changes. and sort of explain to you what's changed this year. And you'll probably be really pleased to hear that the new guidance is in no way revolution. It is slightly evolutionary, and there are some interesting and noticeable changes, but you'll be pleased that it's not going to be any radical new directions or additional work that you have to undertake. So, Giles, next slide, please. Right. So you may or may not be aware, but from April 2022, the business rates payments process has changed, and some billing authorities have opted to submit their bills not to you as trusts, but directly to the SFA. Now, if you do fall into this camp, I'm sure you're aware of it, because you won't have received an invoice at April, and your management accounts this year will be sort of showing costs up until April, and then it'll sort of fall off a cliff. Now, what the accounts direction is saying is, if you do fall into this camp and you are one of the trusts who fall under a local authority who are billing directly to the SFA, then you need to gross up the income and expenditure. And what I mean by that is that you bring in the cost of the business rate scheme, so you debit your expenditure, but you also sort of show the other side as income, so you increase your gag income accordingly. I mean, I must reiterate that some authorities are not doing this and are continuing under the same scheme. So if you're continuing to get invoices from them, the process is going to remain unchanged. But you may have been familiar with this idea of grossing up if your trust has taken advantage of the risk protection arrangement, because of course in that scenario what you're normally supposed to do is again sort of show the expenditure of being a part of the scheme, but also sort of boost your income. Good. Next slide, please, Giles. Now, conflicts of interest is a really interesting area. I think when I first started being involved with Academy Trusts in 2012, I mean, the rules were pretty anodyne, in so much that you effectively just had to kind of follow what was already existing there for charities. So there was some sort of indications that you need to be mindful of conflicts of interests and related party transactions, but actually, you know, since that point, there have been some really, you know, public and embarrassing situations where trusts abused that. You know, there were some sort of large trusts who maybe, you know, ended up having, you know, a company on the side which was owned by the chief executive, and they were sort of billing the trust. And because of these embarrassing scenarios, you know, continually the SFA seems to be upping the ante and sort of making it harder and harder to enter these kinds of transactions. Now, my colleague Mark is going to say a little bit more about this later, so I'm not going to steal his thunder. But interestingly, you know, there has been another ratchet up this year in terms of the accounts direction, because they're putting new requirements in and asking trusts to actually talk about the processes they have in place to manage conflicts of interest. And even, you know, in relation to things like joint ventures or trading subsidiaries, if that's applicable. Now, I want to be absolutely clear here that, you know, in my experience, the SFA does read your statutory accounts. And, you know, for instance, if you are disclosing a related party transaction in there and they can see you haven't followed the given guidelines, they absolutely will come after you after the year ends and challenge you. So, you know, it is absolutely important to get things right in the accounts. And if you are disclosing transactions, I think you have to be really watertight in how you've managed them. But I think for sort of this year, you know, what they're sort of saying is they want a bit more disclosure in the trustees' report, talking about what systems are in place. And I would suggest that as a minimum, you want to talk about the fact that you will have a register of interests, and, you know, how you use that register to kind of, you know, manage day-to-day management and governance questions within the trust. Great, Charles. Next slide, please. So severance payments is also sort of another interesting area where, again, they've sort of upped the ante a little bit. And what they're asking trusts to do is to disclose scenarios where you have made non-contractual severance payments, and that's important. So this is, you know, where you sort of have had to gone above, you know, statutory requirements or above contractual requirements to make a settlement, they're asking you to put a table in the accounts, which looks a bit like the one I've got up on the slide, where you're effectively sort of saying, you know, we've made settlements on a number of ranges and how many settlements in that range you've made. So this table, for instance, this example, I'm kind of saying, well, you know, this trust has made 5 settlements between 0 and 25,000 and so on. Now, you're probably aware that the Trust Handbook, which again, Mark will talk about in a minute, it does put a number of requirements in there about how you make non-contractual severance payments. And, you know, generally trusts will need to get legal advice before they do so to make sure that it's, you know, justified and that it represents good value for money. And, you know, if payments are greater than 50,000, you actually are supposed to get ESFA prior approval before you enter the transaction. So sort of being a bit cynical here, I'm wondering if actually the SFA are sort of trying to make things easy for themselves so they can sort of quickly see, you know, which trusts have entered into arrangements greater than £50,000 and then can sort of go away and sort of check whether they do get prior approval. So it is certainly something to sort of think about and be aware of as we sort of put these accounts together. Great, next slide, please, Giles. So this one's nice and straightforward. If you are lucky enough to be a teaching school, you know, teaching hub, you know, historically you've had to put into the accounts a kind of a note which talks about the financial activity relating to the teaching school activity. And you'll be really delighted to hear that moving forward, you no longer have to prepare that note. So that's great. It makes life a little bit easier. But I would sort of make the point that if teaching school activity is material for your trust, then you would still sort of need to show it as a separate activity on the face of the SOFA, and likewise, you know, all the appropriate notes would need to have a bit of detail in them. But so generally, I think, you know, most trusts who have a teaching school, it's likely that they can sort of reduce disclosure in that area. Great, Giles, thank you. Right, so the accounts direction is asking trusts to say a little bit more about service concession arrangements, and I had no idea what a service concession arrangement was when I first read this, but actually, you know, what they're drilling down here, you know, into is PFI schools. So, you know, if you're in that position where you have got a PFI arrangement, it's not an enormous new disclosure, but they are asking you to put a narrative note into the accounts to kind of, you know, explain, you know, a little bit more detail what the nature of that arrangement is. Now, if you go to Coketown, the model accounts, there's very little in there which actually, you know, gives you guidance on how you might sort of craft the notes. But if you're crafting, you go into the accounts direction, they have actually put some model wording in there. And for those of you who are interested, it's section 3.46 of the accounts, where they're actually sort of put together this kind of model form of words. And I'll read it out very quickly, just so you get an idea of the sort of things they want you to talk about. But what they're suggesting you say is something along the lines of, the Academy Trust occupies premises which are subject to private finance initiative. The trust itself is not party to the service concession contract. However, the Academy Trust has entered into supporting agreements towards the cost of the local authority. The above relates to commitments to operating payments, including costs for catering, cleaning, utilities, and other services. So, you know, it's not an enormous note, but I think it will add a little bit of flesh for readers. Great. So this next point is more of a clarification, really, in terms of how to interpret accounting standards. And it's really all about the situation where, you know, you may have a new school or a school building being constructed by the DFE on your behalf. And, you know, I think there has been sort of a lot of debate, certainly when we've been in discussions with the SFA at auditors forums, it's something that's come up a number of times, is, you know, how do you recognise the new building? At what point do you recognise it? And so the SFA have been really good, and they've kind of, you know, spelled out exactly how it should work. So basically, if you're lucky enough to be in a situation where the DFE is making a building on your behalf, then you wouldn't recognise that that new building until it's finished, until it's actually finished, it's ready for use. And that's the point they think you bring it into your accounts. And, you would normally bring it into your accounts along with, at the valuation provided, and the other side would be shown as capital income. If you're in a sort of hybrid situation, though, where you are sort of doing a little bit of work yourself, but the trust, DFE is also doing a fair amount of work. What they're also saying is that as you go along, that money you're contributing yourself should go into the accounts as an asset under construction. So a separate class of fixed assets, which then gets sort of transferred into final value when it's completed. But it's a relatively rare scenario, and I wouldn't expect many people to come across it. Great. Next slide, please, Giles. So I did mention earlier that there was this, rather interesting sort of ancillary documents, the auditors framework, and it did point out areas they DFE think that auditors should be looking out for in terms of, ensuring the accounts are, providing all the information that they want to see. And I think the sort of top one, board effectiveness, is a really interesting area. I think sort of Mark was previously sort of mentioning in his talk about, how governance is sort of important and seems to be going up in the government's agenda, and sort of has been alluded to in the white paper. And I think this is probably a bit of a bit more of a push in that direction, in so much that they want you as a trust to talk about, what the trust is doing to review its existing governance arrangements. And, if nothing has happened in the last 12 months, when you think you will have a chance to do that. So, if you're asking yourselves, how a trust might approach that individually, I think there's lots of, really useful tools out there that trusts can employ to kind of consider their governance structure. You may well be aware of the 21 questions that multi-academy trusts should be asking themselves, which was published some years ago. I think that's a really good framework, for instance, that trusts can sort of do independently. Alternatively, you may want to get the internal auditors involved, and they could sort of do a governance review. But certainly, I think trusts do now need to absolutely be thinking about how they're going to review their governance structures in place. And because of this direction, I think you do need to be saying more about it in your statutory accounts. Another one which is sort of related is internal scrutiny. Again, I think this is going up in terms of the government's agenda. I don't know if many of you can remember the day of responsible officer visits. When this sort of internal scrutiny idea first kicked off, it was sort of fairly anodyne. They had a vision, I think, of retired accountants popping in once a term and counting the petty cash and checking the bank rec. And without a doubt, we've moved on a lot since then, and it's becoming more and more, like professional internal audit. So, I think what they're sort of saying is that, certainly trusts need to say more about the frequency of the work. I'd suggest that probably you need to be saying more about what you're doing more generally, as I said, it does seem to be going up in the agenda. And finally, quite a surprise for me is I thought this one had sort of been put to bed, but there is this sort of weird nuance in academy accounts that to follow the charity SORP, you need to talk about the name and salary of trustees, and of course, a number of employees tend to be trustees as well in an academy trust. And I think, initially people sort of felt there was a bit of a mismatch with the charity SORP and, this unfair scenario where teachers may find their salaries sort of put into the public domain. But the SFA have been very clear, actually, that this, it does need to be included, and it seems to be a bugbear that some trusts still aren't sort of putting that information in. Good. So I think that covers everything in terms of the accounts direction. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mark, who's going to talk about the Trust Handbook.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark Nicholls from CKCA. We're based in Dudley in the West Midlands. So I'm going to talk to you about the Trust Handbook. James has just touched on the accounts direction. So the accounts direction obviously looks back at last year's in relation to the accounts that you're all preparing now. The Academies Trust Handbook is effective as of September 2022. So it's coming into place now, ready for this financial year. So I think if you can click on Giles. In terms of what's changed, there's not a lot in terms of numbers of changes. Helpfully, there's included a list of what has changed in the start of the Trust Handbook. And you can see from some of the wording, you've got confirming, clarifying, confirming. They are clarifying and just making clear exactly what's intended. So they're not radical changes to the handbook, but there are some important clarifications included. So I'll go through those each point there. If you can go to the next slide, Giles. So the BFRO, the reporting outturn, has been scrapped. Now the outturn information will be recorded in the same return as part of the BFR to be submitted in July. That's the change. So it frees up a bit of trust's time, really reduces the reporting requirement slightly. Just a reminder on that, trustees should be approving those budgets before they are submitted. And where a deficit budget is planned, ESFA should be notified within 14 days of the trust agreeing it. Yep, okay, so next slide, Giles. Next point on special payments. So this is clarification, really. So James touched on where prior approval is required for £50,000 special payments. The handbook clarifies exactly what a special payment is. And this comes out of HM Treasury's guidance on public sector payments. So it makes it clear exactly what a special payment is. On the next slide, we've got a list of examples of what they relate to. So you've got any payments under a settlement agreement, write-offs of loans as examples. So there's a list there. It's anything unusual, non-contractual, and prior approval would be required for anything above 50,000. As James said, they may be looking at that table to check if prior approval is required when the accounts are submitted. So again, not really a change, it's more of a clarification there. Okay, next slide. The next one, indemnities. So previously, prior approvals required for indemnities from the handbook. The Academy Trusts now have permission to enter into indemnities in the normal course of business. So what would the normal course of business be? They have provided a list on a supplementary document. So that would be things like catering, data sharing agreements, energy contracts, IT contracts, and land transactions for land transfer to the trust. So it does make a bit more sense to give the trusts a little bit more leeway in terms of not obtaining permission for every indemnity they enter into. Where an indemnity is entered into, trustees should always challenge, as it could be putting the trust at risk, but it may be getting best value for money. We've got a suggestion there that a contract register, just to keep a list of what indemnities have been entered into, might be a good idea for the trusts. Okay, next slide. And the only real change, if we can call it, so the cost requirement for related party transactions has always applied to dioceses, but the extension in the Academy Trust Handbook is that it applies to all religious entities, so not necessarily a diocese. So given that a religious school can only get that service from one particular religious provider organisation, that's just been extended to clarify that point. Okay, and that's the main changes in the handbook. One thing that yeah, thanks, Giles. So one thing that we were expecting to change, and it may have been a reason for there being a delay in the publishing of the Academy's Trust Handbook, is to do with leases. So under IFRS 16, International Financial Standards, there's no distinction between finance leases and operating leases. The Trust Handbooks previously stated that a trust needs permission to enter into a finance lease. There was a plan announced in March that the trust would be given more devolved responsibility and could enter into certain finance leases for certain products. That was to get parity with local authorities that would be reporting under IFRS 16. In July, it was announced that has been delayed. So we are expecting that to still come in, but not yet. So as far as things stand at the moment, leases are we still do require permission for finance leases from ESFA. So next slide, please, Giles. So James and I are now going to go through some of what we'd see as regularity pitfalls. So things that could go wrong, areas of the handbook that could be misinterpreted or just missed, and tend to be where there may be regularity modifications in reports and where ESFA sees. Sorry, Giles, if you could go back that one. So while we're on leases, photocopies is a good example, but applies to a lot of leases. Some leases are difficult to tell whether they are operating or finance leases. So yeah, it's something that academies do often fall over on. Advice there would be, I suppose, talk to your auditor. There's calculations that can be done before entering into the lease and may prevent modification of a regularity report. Okay, next slide.
So this is an interesting area, a bit contentious, but I mean, the Trust Handbook is absolutely clear that trusts cannot spend any money at all whatsoever on alcohol unless it's within the context of religious ceremonies. So, you know, if for instance, you're a Catholic school and you do mass. Now, I'm going to be contentious here. I'm going to say that actually I sort of disagree with the SFA on this. I mean, I can remember auditing a standalone trust many years ago, before it was strictly prohibited. He used to spend a fair amount each year for a sort of big shindig with their staff. And, you know, I remember sort of seeing the bill and seeing the amounts of bottled wine purchased, and I sort of challenged the head teacher. And his response has always sort of stayed with me, that, you know, he felt that party was very much, you know, about sort of building the family atmosphere at the school. And actually, when I went away and looked at it and compared it to other trusts we worked with, it had a fantastic you know, staff retention rates. You know, their agency costs were much lower because you know, actually staff sickness was really low. So I think there is situations actually where you need to show that you appreciate your staff. And, you know, buying a bottle of wine, you know, I think isn't an unreasonable way of doing it. But, you know, I think I'm probably an outlier here. And, you know, the rules are what they are. So unfortunately, you have to be, you know, super careful to make sure that you're not ending up sort of inadvertently paying for alcohol. And, you know, there are many situations you can slip up on this one. So I think we found one situation where the trustees went out for a meal, and lo and behold, they brought a few bottles of wine, and, you know, has effectively, you know, breached the rules. Or there was another situation where it was a big mat, and then one of the primary schools had bought a bottle of whiskey to say thank you to someone. And, you know, it's really easy, I think, to fall foul of this. So it's just important to keep getting that message out to staff to be, you know, to be super careful. And, you know, if they really want to buy a bottle of wine for someone, what they have to do is buy them a John Lewis voucher and tell them to go and pick it out themselves. Right, next slide, please, Giles.
Okay, the next point is related parties. Big on the agenda, as James mentioned earlier, with the narrative reporting coming in the accounts direction. So a reminder of what's required. Trusts must ensure that there's registers of interest completed by relevant individuals, and there should be sufficient reporting at meetings and declarations where there are interests. So where things could fall down, I suppose prior approval may not be obtained where it's required to for contracts over 20,000. If you could just move along, sorry, Giles. There we go, and again, thank you. So prior approval required for any contracts or transactions that were total more than 20,000, and reporting for any related party transactions, whether above 20,000 or not, but retrospectively. Also the at-cost requirements for any transactions above 2,500. So what can a trust do to ensure they don't fall foul of the related party transaction rules? Regular review of register of interests, possibly something on the software system that would flag up any suppliers that could be related parties, and yeah, just searches on Companies House and other databases that may flag up anything that's not been declared. Next thing, John.
So this is another interesting area, and another area which I'm convinced is going up on the government's agenda is this idea of internal scrutiny, which as I've already mentioned, started off as sort of something quite anodyne that they wanted people to kind of do on a voluntary basis, and is sort of morphing over the years to be something much more complex. Now, there are a number of trusts who sort of end up with regularity issues because they're not doing anything at all. And hopefully all you guys who are here today have got something in place. But I mean, so I think my first message is, if you haven't, you absolutely need to have this in place. But I think there's also a sort of ancillary message here that, as I said, it is changing, and I'm getting the feeling, the mood music is that they're expecting trusts to kind of engage with this testing as a more strategic level. So, it isn't just now about looking at petty cash tins or bank recs, and they want you to look at things like, what's good governance, or, more strategic questions around the trust. So, even if you have something in place, I would encourage you as a trust to also maybe start thinking about, maybe how you move that forward. Thanks, Giles.
This is the final one that we've noted as a possible pitfall. It's management reporting. Something where ESFA does still see modifications to regularity reports, but it is decreasing as the changes came in a few years ago. So must be shared with the chair every month, and with other trustees 6 times a year. Yeah, I think the rules are quite clear, and probably smaller trusts are the ones that are still possibly falling foul of this. But yeah, it's still there. I think that's it, Giles.
Thanks both. We've got we have a question there, James. You had a slide which was talking about the disclosures and accounts for DFE construction work. There's a question saying, what about local authority funded assets?
I think that's a jolly good question, and I probably should have thought about this when I put my slides together, because you're right, the guidance talks about DFE scenarios, but actually, local authority getting involved is a very common scenario as well. And what I would say is that actually, that guidance from the SFA in the accounts direction is really sort of harking back to reporting standards, which says that you should recognise an asset when you're entitled to it. So, when you've got sort of the risk and rewards are yours, when it's probable you're going to actually sort of get it, and when you can reliably value it. Now, I would sort of say that probably with local authority arrangements, I would say that the same rules apply. So it's likely that you would follow the same approach. But what I would also do is go back to that individual agreement, Michelle, and I'd have a think about it, just make sure there's nothing in there unusual which kind of might change our view on any of those 3 points. So I think probably you would end up using the same approach, but the devil is in the detail.
Yeah, it's always a risk when you ask someone else's auditor when their auditor's already on the call, isn't it? But
do you have a different view, Giles?
No, I think you said the right thing, James.
Phew.
But thank you for the question, Michelle. Okay, excellent. Thank you both. That was very clear. We will move on. Next session, getting the best out of your auditors. We've got one slide for this. David is you are now chairing this session. David and I are presenting this together, but David's going to chair, and we're aiming for this to be sort of a bit more conversational. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Giles. So yeah, I'm
we're just going to try and finish this section at 12, David.
Yeah. Well, I got my timer on, so hopefully we should keep within time. So yeah, thank you, Giles. I'm David Wright, partner at the newly rebranded Westcott's Chartered Accountants, previously Thomas Westcott, but now Westcott's. So yeah, I think Giles and I are going to play this kind of, make it conversational, where Giles is the auditor and I'll kind of be the on the academy side and interview Giles and get some discussion going that way around. Like the slide says, getting the best out of your auditors. So Giles, you're going to be both internal and external auditor for the purposes of this. So I guess starting with external audit, it's cliche that communication is key. Would you say that's, is that true for audit?
I think that's very much so. So much of good auditing. When we think about client relations, it's also training on staff is about communication, and that's in planning and delivery and reporting results, which is about conversations and about sort of written communication.
Yeah. And how do you like communications to work from your point of view?
Well, there's communications, of course, inside and outside the audit period. If we talk about inside the audit period, fundamentally, it's got to work for you, the client. You're paying the bill. This is a service you're procuring for us. It's got to work for you, and particularly for the CFO. And if it's not working for you, then say so, because different auditors work differently, but different trusts work differently, and different CFOs will have different preferences. So if someone's just come from another audit and have worked out how to be dealing with that, so that method may not work for you. So tell them how you work. I mean, I would ask you, how open is your door?
Yeah, I mean, I would always say, my door would always be open. I think that that would be the best way the sort of communication would work.
But at the same time, some other CFOs will work differently and prefer to be saying, come to me in this hour this morning, and then the same hour the next day. Because we've got to be aware that you've got a day job that isn't the audit, and you've got to let us know that. I think you should be, as an absolute, you should be expecting regular updates from your auditor, telling you what they're looking at and what they're finding. They will want to be talking about the issues as they find them. They can't always do so, but they will want to be, because then they can clear them off more recently and they can have a tidier file. They can get through a section. But we do continue to audit. Be aware, we do continue to audit after we've left, assuming we're attending, after the testing week, and we'll be processing what you've given us and we'll be reviewing. So you must expect queries later. I mean, one thing sometimes asked, to clear up queries, would you like us back on site? Would you welcome us back on site?
Yeah, and I guess if I was a client, I'd prefer the auditors to come back on site. I think that keeps it most efficient way possible. But I think every client's different, and like you say, it's understanding what each client wants, and making sure as external auditor you're caring for their needs essentially.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, that's really useful. You talked about communication outside the audit, so sort of year-round communication. What sort of questions would you expect outside of the audit?
I think it's helpful. It's helpful for us to get questions out for outside the audit from a selfish point of view as auditor. Not least because the audit time period in October or November is pressured, and if it can help us do some work outside that we would otherwise do inside, it takes the pressure off. If we, for example, we might steer you to a better accounting treatment, a more acceptable accounting treatment, we save time later and we avoid an adjustment. If you have a regularity issue that we can steer you in the right direction for, again, that helps during the audit period, that helps reduce discussions and issues. Those are very general responses, but specifically, if you've got questions about a new asset on depreciation rate, ask us about it. If you've got new grants, and this is one that when we're not doing it, when we're doing charities that aren't academies, very, very often we will be talking about grants as we come up to the year end, because there's technical judgment issues around recognition and are they restricted, so you get those right in your accounts. You will be getting queries from your actuaries as you come up or past the year end. Do talk to us about their queries. If you have possibly novel plans, we've had questions, and there may be people on this call who recognise this, but we've had questions during the year where they're considering leases of computers for the students. And some of you will have done that, but that is something that hadn't been done before. So we had a look at that. And this year, in times of inflation, there have been suggestions that academies give advances to constructors to enable them to buy steel ahead of the work to fix the price. Now, in commercial world, that's a sensible thing, but there's an element that it's a punt. So again, what issues does that raise for commerciality? Does it's aimed to give you value for money, but does it work for regularity? Again, new related party arrangements, they keep coming up. Settlement payments, and talk to you about the regularity of those and the disclosures. And leases. Leases is tricky. You can see what a lease is. Your lease company will tell you this is an operating lease, this is an operational lease. Of course they are, but they're not the accountant, and they're not the people who've got to sign off the audit report on it. So do talk to your auditors on that. And also on catering, because catering, while we were hoping for a relaxation in the catering rule, in the rules on leases, as Mark said, but while we have lease contracts that include the provision of ovens and kitchen equipment, they may be embedded leases that may fall foul of regularity. So talk about all sorts of things. When you're talking about new activities, new projects, again, we will be finely attuned to be saying, there's a VAT issue, or there may be a corporation tax issue. So keep us in the picture.
Fantastic. So yeah, I think you just listed quickly there some, why it's really important to get that year-round communication going, and not just the audit becoming just a once-a-year exercise. So thank you for that. I think you probably hear from a lot of academy clients. They know what they want from their audit. No stress, no complications, a quick audit. How would you deliver that?
That's a big question. It's what we're aiming for. We're on the same side. We want quick, fast is normally better. I think it's about if you can be having conversations with your auditor about the information the auditor wants and how they process it. If you understand that the auditor is normally digitized, they're normally going to take a piece of information, put it on their file, do some analysis and tick it. So if you're sending something quite straightforward, like if you're sending a piece of analysis on projections, your going concern projections, say, send us a PDF, but send us the Excel as well. It just helps us to add it up and have a look and see at the assumptions behind it. That just eases the process. If you talk to your auditor, it may be helpful for them to have access into the software so that they can pick and inspect documents in your software. It may be quicker for them to do. They may not need the document, they may just be able to tick it, and it may avoid having to pull documents and send them over. If you said, I tell you what auditors, they sort of kind of don't like information in dribs and drabs, but they'll put up with it and they'll collate it as long as they can see how it's organized, but don't expect them to be analyzing it and working on it in dribs and drabs, because that's terrifically inefficient. So talk to them. They'll probably want to use a portal. Another thing is try and know your fund balances. That's another thing that helps our audit. Know particularly your unspent capital grants. Most of you all know that, because it's very hard to work out our fund. We can work on prepayments and accruals and do some analysis, but if you don't know your unspent capital balances, it's hard for us to second guess.
Yeah. Okay, so some really good points there about, I think some really good organizational points, and it's a two-way street. Both make each of us lives as easy as possible, and we get to the goal of it. The no stress, no complications, quick audit. So some good stuff in there. I guess it'd just be really useful to understand, what else as auditors you're able to do if asked. What the rules permit. What do your firms? What can your firms offer outside
what the
of
rules
audit?
permit is very relevant, because they do permit less than they did. There was a change in ethical standards approximately 2 years ago. So where we may, for instance, have been able to help with installation of some software. We can't do that anymore. What we can do generally is we can advise on taxes. We can advise. We do have VAT specialists. VAT is nasty and mixed, and it does unpredictable things, as those in the workshop coming up will find out. Most of us, before we were academy auditors, we were advisors to charitable companies and auditors of charitable companies. So we are used to the issues around a charitable company that's setting up a trade that might not be within its objects, and how we manage that. So we know about trade and restructuring and charity tax exemptions. We've got payroll taxes. We will have specialists in that. We know how to deal with HMRC. We do trustee training. Many of us just ask, and we will tailor it to what you want. That can be trustees or senior leadership or finance staff or governors. One of the best sessions I did, I think, was in a trust that was coming together, was with their local governing board with governors. So it's not strictly trustees, but it was getting people to understand their responsibilities. So talk to your auditor. They may do more than you think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, again, comes back to good communication, understanding what your auditor can offer you outside of the audit, which is sounds like, generally quite a lot. What's your view on interim audit and coming out before the main visit? Do you see that works quite well?
Some and some. As we said before, the audit program in October, November is busy, and if we can shift some of that to a less busy earlier time, we will do so. If we can hit some known issues early, we will do so. So, for instance, what we might do is we might be looking, if we came in July, we might be able to look at 10 months worth of purchases and payroll testing, which we just leave a bit to finish off. We might be, particularly a new client will want to do it because we'll want to be confirming the systems and the risks. If you've had a change of accounting system such that we need to do sort of an additional opening balance or transfer balance test, then we'll do that. But a lot of the time, it's most efficient to work in the autumn.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And just a couple of questions around communication. Again, you'll develop a close relationship with the finance team at the academy. What about outside of the finance team, the sort of the wider trustees? Yeah,
and it is very easy. We naturally get really good relationships with the CFO and finance officer because that's who we deal with most frequently. But we are reporting to the trustees, and of course the accounting officer is the CFO. And I think sometimes if it's not, you need to have good relationships with the chair of audit and the accounting officer, more than just the reporting at the end. And I think if that's not happening, then actively go out and make it happen, because the audits where we have those, and it doesn't happen, and it might be formal meetings you set up before the audit each year, or it might just be having done that, then you've got naturally open lines of communication. But we do benefit because there are different perspectives, and they may have concerns that we can slant audit procedures towards them.
So really important to outside of the finance team. In terms of a debrief, do you seek to get a debrief?
Yes, and clients, they may not. We can do a debrief after. I mean, the audit finishes in December, doesn't it? And we can do a debrief in January, February. But actually, if we've got our wash-up meeting with the finance team? If you just start it off saying, "How did the audit go?" you find out, and so we will do it informally, even if we're not doing it formally. And we've got to, because we know there's a different perspective, and we know we're not always doing things perfectly. We know we can get a bit better each year. So I think do it as early, almost while the audit's going on, and then you're fresh. Everything's fresh in the mind.
Good to see you always seeking to improve, which is what we want. And what about choosing an external auditor? What would you say the key points there to consider?
It's like James, I'm going to be a bit controversial. There's a pretty good, I think the S for Guide is pretty good, and it talks about what you need to know about the external auditor, about experience with individuals, and expect to meet them and asking about the value added. And there's a good list, and there's some good advice in there, and that's been compiled with the auditor for help of the auditor forum, which most of us are on. But how do you find this? Is where I disagree is how to find them. Yes, talk to other academies. Yes, to your colleagues in school business manager forums. Yes, have a look at the register of statutory auditors, because that'll tell you nearby firms. But there was also advice to look at the framework, which I think is a very, very limited. If you look at the framework, it won't give you the firms local to you who are good and doing academies, because it's just poorly designed. So apart from the advice to look at the framework, I would say have a look at the ESFA advice on this.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Should we just say something about internal audit? Do we need?
I was just going to move on. Got a couple of minutes before we go into the breakout. So we've talked about external audit. Getting the most out of the internal audit, I guess. What would your views on that be?
Pulling it back to the question, to get the most out of the internal auditor, it's about scoping, isn't it? And there are different trusts have different complexities. We go from single academy trusts up to trusts with 10, 20, 30 schools and different complexities. And it's about, you can go to very, very scientific methods of doing risk and mapping out processes and risk analyzing processes. You can also, and I think I would recommend this in a lot of trusts, just mapping out their assurance, starting from looking at the risk register. What are the risks? What are the assurance? What are the sources of insurance? Which of those sources are the internal audit? And that will give you a pointer. But whatever process you go to, you should be coming. The internal audit should then come up with a sort of a list and a likely program that goes beyond your financial controls. It goes to your real risks, and talk to them about what they can offer. They may be able to offer more than you expect. So they may be able to look at HR. They may be able to look at premises, sort of capital risks, but there are certain things you shouldn't necessarily. They may not be the experts on looking in detail at cyber, which is in any trust it's in the top 2 risks. So there may be other specialists. So do be open-minded to looking at different suppliers as well, I think, on that.
Okay. Good stuff. Thank you very much, Giles. I think that's probably concludes it from my point of view. I hope that gives everybody, a flavour of what else auditors can do, both on the external and internal front, and it's not just viewed as a once-a-year exercise. There's so much more that we can do.
But I also think you've got an ESFA push on this, that you will be having management reporting from external auditors and internal, of course, and do keep an action log on those points, and do come back on them as an audit committee to check that things have been resolved, because they won't all necessarily be resolved first time round, but just keep following up and ensure that, especially on internal audit, the follow-up audits happen.
Yeah, no, definitely agreed.
Okay, we are now moving into, I don't have any specific questions on that, to the workshops. And what we're on the workshops, this is the practical. This is where we need input from you. We're going to go into these workshops. We'll come out of the workshops at 20 past and ask each group to feed back on 2 or 3 key points. Okay. We've just got a minute or two just to talk about each set of feedback. Can we hear back from, I think, VAT? We haven't had enough about VAT today yet.
It's music to my ears, Giles. There was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, to be honest, on VAT, and as you know, I could talk about VAT for hours on end if anybody gave me the chance. But the observation that was made, I guess, is that even under the VAT 126 regime, i.e. for those academies and trusts that aren't VAT registered, there is still a requirement to do something to calculate the VAT that you can recover. It's not as simple as just claiming it all back. I would say in 99 cases out of 100, that will be the case, yeah.
Sharky, thank you for that takeaway. Do we have someone from HR?
Sure, Giles. So we had a really interesting session actually, because all the participants in there were sort of in a similar space, in so much that they were looking to either systemize approaches over a number of schools, or potentially sort of get some strategy across a trust. And that, I think, sort of is quite difficult actually to do from scratch. If you have to sort of invent that wheel yourself. So we talked about ways about how they can maybe share best practice, or how they get ideas about sharing things like approaches to getting feedback from staff. So yeah, it was very helpful, and I think actually the one good thing about the sector is that people do share ideas with each other, and maybe those 3 schools could maybe get together and actually sort of help each other moving forward.
Thank you. And David, in our inflation we talked, did we find the magic bullet? You're on mute, David.
Yeah, no, thanks, Giles. No, unfortunately, didn't find the magic bullet, but had a good session, shared, good practice. A lot of focus on energy costs, obviously. Talking the press of apocalyptic situations, cuts to jobs, and all this kind of thing. The government have pledged 6-month energy to support. That a bit concerned about. Nobody knows quite what the detail looks behind that, but more importantly, we don't know what's going to happen post 6 months. I think the conclusion was more support is going to be required over and above the 6 months. But yeah, some good ideas around what we can do to cut energy consumption. One trust is using LED lights, which has been working well, and some grants out there as well. I think one trust has quite a substantial grant.
Me was that all were in agreement that if things go in a certain direction, which might be that pay rises are approved at a certain level, cost cutting is going to be needed. And no one's quite got those plans fixed yet. I mean, people are looking at ideas and consulting, and then we'll need to move quite fast. But everyone is at the thing that it is common that people are in the thinking stage on that, and looking ahead and doing their what ifs. And of course, the auditors are going to ask them about their what ifs when we come to sign off on going concern at the end. Hopefully by November we'll have a bit more clarity. Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you for the speakers for their presentation. Thank you for all in the workshops for being open to the conversations. I'm delighted that the software's worked. It's got us in and out of sessions. I hope you've all been stimulated and have food for thought, and perhaps a little better equipped for the months ahead. As I said, I've got particular thanks to the speakers. As I said at the start, in the PrimeGlobal firms, we're independent firms, but we collaborate, and we have Academy specialist group where we share our intelligence and challenges, so that which gives us much broader perspective and equips us to advise you, our clients, much better. Special mention to Lizzie Craig of Larking, Gowen, who's our HR manager, our business development manager, who has chased and harried us in the nicest possible way to make this all work in a way that we designed, which is the most complicated way we could have put a seminar together with workshops and different speakers. But thank you very much, Lizzie. Wow, it's worked. Congratulations. And thank you all for coming and contributing, and for your questions and participation. And now, without saying anything more, I'm going to wish you all a good day and a good week, and we wind this up now. Goodbye. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you, Giles.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.